All right, you guys, second to last panel of the day. And we are going to explore the growing voluntary carbon markets, integrating compliance and pathways to merge with compliance systems. So joining us for this session, we have Eamon Jubbawy, founder and CEO of Isometric. Next, we have Pippa Howard, Chief Nature Strategist at NatureMetrics. Next, we have Valerio Magliulo, CEO and co-founder of Abatable. And we have our moderator, Klier, CEO of South Pole.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Second to last panel, so we have to be really exciting, otherwise the energy will drop, and we will try to do this. We obviously had a carbon market panel just ahead of us, and I think what we're going to talk about is a very natural continuation of that conversation. Very briefly, maybe introduction, Klier. I'm still reasonably new, Chief Executive of South Pole, a little bit less than a year. London-based. South Pole is the largest player in the carbon market. We represent about 15 to 20% of the market. We have probably 400, 500 projects currently live in the market, with a workforce of about 1,000 colleagues. And so this is an ecosystem that we are very active in, that we're very familiar with, and we observe three big trends. One trend the last panel just explored, the big push for higher integrity, risk management practices. I think Tommy explained his view of the world. I come from the financial services sector. We look at the carbon market as a currently unregulated market that needs to perform at the same principles as a regulated market. And that's how we model our own business, and we obviously partner with people like Tommy. The second big trend that is heavily discussed in the carbon market is the shift from avoidance credits to removal credits. Very different instrument, much more complicated, much more capital intensive, feels a bit like infrastructure development, both on the nature side, where you essentially need to plant a forest, or on the technical side, where you build a direct air capture facility. And then the third big trend that we're seeing is the purpose of this panel discussion, the move from a market that is 99% voluntary to a market that has very, very strong compliance characteristics and is converging. And from where I'm sitting, I think where probably many of us are sitting, that is exciting because you start to create true demand signals that are permanent. But it's also scary because it is very, very fragmented. The last panel touched briefly on this. There's the UN Article 6 market, the Japanese JCM market, the European Union introducing something called CRCF that people can just start to learn to spell. And so it's very exciting because finally we have a 5-year outlook that is super exciting in terms of demand, but also very scary because it's fragmented. And that's, I think, what we want to explore together in a world where clearly the decarbonization of the economy isn't going as well as it should. And I think that mechanism is so essential to unlock the amount of finance that we need to achieve anything close to net zero. And with that, I would love to bring in first Eamon, who's the Chief Executive and founder, I think, founder of Isometric, one of the big, probably fastest growing registries out there. I think you managed to create a real buzz around yourself, around the quality, the new approach. We see huge demand, and be very curious to get your view. We're shifting from a world where we're still discussing, let's call it historical issues. The last panel was still discussing, hopefully to a large degree, historical issues, to a world where we're suddenly looking at a market that is a compliance market. A compliance market by design is a bit more like a regulated market. And what needs to happen? What infrastructure do we need to get there? And maybe say 2 words about your business before you answer the question.
Sure, thank you. Thank you for the very kind intro. So, as Daniel said, so I'm Eamon. I'm the founder and CEO of Isometric. Isometric is a carbon registry. We focus just on removals, so we don't issue credits for any avoidance activities. We issue credits across all removal pathways, from long duration pathways like direct air capture and enhanced rock weathering, right down to nature-based pathways like reforestation. And our big thing is trust. Like, that's essentially what we sell. We're in the business of selling trust to buyers of credits who identify high quality projects, get very excited about the work that they're doing, the potential to scale, but they just need that independent third party to validate the claims that are being made by the project and issue the credits in a fashion that they can trust. And so your question was about this voluntary market starting to move in the direction where it might one day become regulated or merge with compliance markets. And I think trust is the key part of the equation there again. For us, there's a few different components to trust. We talk about scientific rigor being something that's very important for us. So, you know, we have a deep bench of scientists who write the protocols or kind of like rules for crediting and try and ensure they're in line with best available science, excuse me. Secondly, we talk about transparency as maybe the most critical component of trust. And for us, transparency is you know, more than just making information available. It's making it accessible and understandable, and helping market participants validate the claims themselves. Because, you know, I think there was this old world, you talked about historical legacy issues, where a lot of weight was put on like a logo of a particular registry or a particular, you know, market actor who tried to confer trust by virtue of, you know, being big and being, you know, around. But we have this different approach where we say, you know, like, we're trying to build this trusted institution, but ultimately, if you don't want to trust us, you don't have to. Go and inspect the data yourself. So don't trust us, trust the data. And that approach, I think, has really resonated. And if we look at the idea of carbon markets starting to reflect financial markets, you know, when you buy you know, an equity on a stock exchange, there's just this standardized, very deep level of data that's available to look at, you know, companies' reports, or you can listen into their earnings calls, or you can do all these things to build your own level of conviction and trust. And that's what we're trying to do: standardize the data, make it available and transparent, to try and build that trust in the market, such that it can become a, you know, a financial asset like an equity that's bought and sold and trusted and traded, without the need for intermediaries to you know, constantly be trying to say, trust us, you know, we know what we're doing.
Brilliant, thank you. And Valerio, maybe I'd come to you. Abatable, you're an integrated carbon market solutions provider, heavily technology enabled. That typically is something that is needed, right? When a market becomes a bit more complicated, trades between voluntary and compliance schemes. What's your view? How will the landscape evolve? What infrastructure is needed? What are different ways that we get from A to B?
Yeah, I think the way I simplify the convergence is it's voluntary supply with compliance demand, right? That's the crux of what we're talking about, is all of a sudden you have pricing mechanisms around the world, as you were describing, that are going to start to allow what typically have been voluntary credits, and so VCM credits. And I think when you frame it in that context, it's very easy to see how there's going to be quite a lot of shifts in my mind. The first one is really around standardization. The transactions themselves are going to become much more standardized, because at the end of the day, what the buyers, what the demand side is going to care about is eligibility, as ensuring that eligibility against their compliance requirement. So transactions are going to be much less about a whole slew of different impact metrics and sort of storytelling, which has been really dominating the voluntary carbon market for a while. So for better or for worse, we're going to see a lot more commoditization happening through the convergence. I think the second one is more exciting for me, which is an expansion of supply. A lot more climate finance finally flowing through sort of the mechanism. We're going to have, you know, certainty in demand in many cases, right? And so that's going to create new markets for all the suppliers, all the investors that are going to deploy capital, which makes it obviously a lot easier to grow and see a path to grow. And then the last one, which is a bit the lesser good, is you were talking about it, is the market is going to be even more fragmented than it already is, right? Today, when you're looking at the voluntary front, there's like tens of standards and registries. There's multiple project types across the entire spectrum, and there's a lot of complications at the local level, at the regional level, jurisdictional level. And when you overlay that with the compliance requirements and what Japan is going to do, what South Korea is doing, what Singapore is doing, and then Article 6, then it starts to become a many-to-many relationship. So you're not just selling into a broader voluntary market, but you need to understand, can I sell into Japanese carbon market? Can I sell into Singapore carbon pricing? So yeah, a lot more fragmentation.
And say a word, how are you playing in this trend? What's your role?
Yeah, I think the way Abatable approaches the market is to be on the corporate side, on the investor side, to help them really interact and transact with the market. So what we've done historically, we've helped clients source over 55 million tons of voluntary carbon credits. So our job and the solutions we've developed are very much sort of translatable quite easily to a compliance world. It's just that what the client is going to be optimizing for is slightly different. They're going to be optimizing slightly less for impact and storytelling and a lot more on eligibility, compliance requirements, insurance product, and a bit more sophistication to the transaction itself. And so we're really starting to see, particularly with Corsia being sort of the real first test of the convergence. It's a voluntary, the compliance scheme for airlines, which involves offsetting through voluntary credits. Which is, one-to-one mapped to what we've been doing historically.
Brilliant. And Pippa, you're the chief nature strategist. You have to explain probably to us what that means at NatureMetrics. And a lot of people like to talk about climate and nature in the same conversations. But they forget that obviously a ton of carbon in Bogota and a ton of carbon in Bangkok are the same. They end up in the atmosphere. Nature isn't, right? Nature isn't fungible. So when we think about emerging compliance markets and way of addressing nature, we have to think local. And be curious to hear from you sort of what are the trends, how does that interplay evolve, and how do we make sure that in this entire discussion we talk about both and not just about the climate discussion.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, Chief Nature Strategist is a very cool title, actually.
Yeah, I love it. Much better than my title.
But yeah, it's all about really mainstreaming nature in the way that we make decisions. Part of that needs to make sure that nature is featured in the whole carbon market too, whether it's through adaptation or mitigation in removals or otherwise. But really, when you talk about high integrity carbon for my company, it's about including nature in the scorecard, essentially, and how you attribute high integrity as well as having social outcomes. There need to be biodiversity outcomes. So NatureMetrics, yeah, it is a molecule, and an electron are probably the easiest things to measure. When you start measuring biodiversity, it's whole ecosystems, sometimes thousands, if not millions, of different species that are occurring in the ecosystems that we are playing the sort of game of essentially carbon capture. And if you think about nature-based solutions, how do we even begin to understand what the value of nature is in those environments? So you asked about where we are at in terms of how we measure it and where the technology's got to. Well, we are founded on environmental DNA technology, so it's taking fragments of DNA in the air, in the soil, in the water. We can swab it off tables and walls and trees, and we can do it in the water. We can do it at the bottom of the ocean. It's a highly, highly malleable and very very exciting technology. And we can amplify that DNA and essentially ascribe species to them. From this, we can get a state of nature metric, or a series of metrics and insights, which is incredible because we can start to see what the health and function of ecosystems are. And if we reflect on the previous session, they talked about MRV, so the monitoring, reporting and verification component of any of these types of projects. We need to be able to monitor this stuff. We need to be able to put it into understandable metrics and insights that allow us to track over time whether the projects are delivering what they set out to deliver. And we've managed to sort of crack that. We're not the only, we are the biggest, and certainly have, I think, working in over 110 countries now, and have a number of carbon projects to our names. But if we match eDNA technology with Earth observation tools, with bioacoustics, with camera traps, you can get an incredible three-dimensional understanding of an ecosystem, and we can start to really measure the state of nature in a way we've never been able to do before. So,
Brilliant.
yeah, it's very cool.
And what's your view on? So we do carbon asset development. We do biodiversity markets in Colombia, in the UK, and other places. It is a much more involved and obviously a much more expensive undertaking to develop biodiversity projects. What's your sense? Is there an appetite in the market? Is there real willingness to engage with it?
It's certainly coming fast, actually. And I think if you look at regenerative agriculture and the role that plays in carbon, in soils, agroforestry, big afforestation or ecosystem restoration, natural forest systems that are being restored, biodiversity is fundamental to actually enabling those systems to recover and to actually sequester carbon in a way that we need them to. So we are seeing sort of a huge amount of progress. When you think about the cost per hectare, that's always the thing, like, oh my gosh, how many taxonomists do you need to send out into the field, specialists? It is expensive if you send individuals into the field. The new technologies are actually completely discounting or taking that burden away. You don't need to be a specialist anymore to go and collect incredible biodiversity data. So I can do it, a farmer can do it, a local community can do it, whoever's out in the field can do it. But importantly, if you think about sampling for carbon or biodiversity on a hectare, that's pretty easy to access. If you're talking about 10,000 hectares or 100,000 hectares, which is often the size of these projects, you've got to start to use inferences. So you need to understand where you need to monitor, where you need to collect data, how often you need to go back, and that we're beginning to get really pretty clever at with species distribution modeling. We all talk about machine learning and AI. That's starting to come into play. But really understanding the association that species have with different types of habitats is a hugely important piece. Understanding soil health is fundamental, and you can start to extrapolate that, but we can get the cost per hectare under $5 now, which is a massive difference to what we were hearing about monitoring soil, actually. I think one of the members of the last panel said it was over 200. I mean, that's crazy. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you very much. Eamon, if this is successful, right, this shift to compliance markets, we will see thousands of new actors come to market because they have to, right? Airlines, shipping companies, European corporates that want to include this in the ETS. But this is a complicated market, right? How do you bridge that gap? The average procurement team doesn't understand all of this.
Yeah. So I think what I've been seeing is various different industries, to different extents, are trying to get ahead of the impending regulation. They don't know exactly when it's coming in. They don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but they have a good idea of the trend towards high quality, in general, trend towards durability. And they have internal strategy teams who price the risk of not complying, and knowing how supply constrained the market is today, it just makes like business sense to enter into long-term offtake contracts, secure supply, lock in a price, and so on. So like it's a kind of a logical step to take as a strategy for a large corporate. But then you start to see, layered on top of that, particular industries who see it as not just a kind of like a risk hedging kind of process ahead of future regulation, but also as a strategic move. So you mentioned shipping, for example. We're seeing all forms of transport industries, in particular shipping, realize that carbon removal is basically just a mass transfer problem. You're moving carbon atoms from one place to another, and guess who's going to be a big player in that industry is shipping. You have mining companies who see the fact that spreading rocks on agricultural land, as you heard on the last panel, like is a massive exciting form of potential carbon removal technology. So who has all the rocks? The mining companies. Like everyone not everyone, many industries are starting to see a strategic angle for them to play a part in carbon removal. And so becoming an early buyer and entering some offtakes and negotiating with suppliers is a very smart strategic move for them to make today, ahead of both impending regulation and the possibility of themselves becoming, a part of this supply chain end to end. And that's been really interesting for us, is helping those buyers navigate those conversations and think about, how carbon removal might play a part in their strategy moving forwards.
Brilliant. And Valerio, can you take us a little bit on a journey what this development will mean for the different players, right? Who will benefit, who's impacted, how should investors in the room think about all the different companies, and please say South Pole will benefit.
I had to build myself a little table because I would forget otherwise someone, and that would be regretful. But I think when you're looking at the supply side and project developers, some of the bigger risks are around, first of all, prices are going to be much more dictated by eligibility rather than the actual sort of true cost of developing the project, and suddenly you're starting to see some projects are not going to be viable for certain compliance market because simply the price per ton in those compliance market is far lower than what it takes to plant a new forest with good biodiversity system in place. But it's also a much more complex sales cycle, much more complex go-to-market strategy, right? You've got eligibility, you need to understand all the different markets and how to work in those specific markets. If you're a project developer in Nicaragua, how does suddenly you're going to think about selling into the Japanese market? That's very high degree of complexity. But it does open up new markets for them. And it brings in certainty of demand, which many project developers and asset developers have really been hoping for. When you're looking at the investor front, I think one of the key things that we hear a lot about is investors that have existing exposure into the carbon market are starting to think about, is my current balance sheet overexposed into areas that are not going to be eligible for the compliance market? Is there a risk there? And at the same time, I think models like South Pole, in terms of being much more of an active asset developer, not just a passive streaming business or investor in a project, are going to have an advantage because they're going to be able to direct the project development and the registration, everything that happens after you planted a seedling, in order to get the best go-to-market. When you're looking at the governments and the countries, I like to split what we call host countries and what we call buyer countries. And host country is simply the country in which a carbon project is located. And I think when you're looking at the host country, there's those without local demand. So, it's perhaps global south countries that don't have big industries and sort of evolved financial markets in many situations. They're going to have to build a lot of administrative capacity in order to be able to to sustain the request from international buyers. But they're going to also have to do a lot of trade-offs with their own NDCs, right? If you're, let's say, a country that is rich in forests and you know that you can deploy a lot of capital, get external capital to protect and conserve and restore those forests, which go to contribute to your own emission reduction as a country, suddenly if somebody's coming in with more bucks for that, how do you trade that off? And with countries instead that have sort of buying a lot of credits, sort of countries like South Korea that has opened up their emission trading scheme to international credits, they're going to have to think carefully of how they balance out allowing international supply in versus fostering local supply, particularly of CDR and sort of particularly in the global north, there's loads that can be done. And for buyers, I mean, it's compliance markets. For compliance buyers, they have to start from scratch. It's a lot more complex than buying allowances, right? It's not just trading allowances with someone else. You need to understand the complexity. You need to understand the eligibility of those credits, but potentially can be more cost effective, right? Today, the cost of EU ETS EEAs is much higher than many of the projects are in the carbon markets. And if you're a VCM buyer today, you're suddenly going to have a lot more competition for the same projects. And so we're starting to see project developers wanting to focus much more on, say, Corsia, and so reducing the available pool of supply for voluntary buyers. And so, overall, a lot of shift across all the actors.
Brilliant. We have a minute and a half left. Maybe one last very quick question to all of you. What excites you the most? 3 years outlook. What's the big thing in our market that gets you out of bed?
So for me, I think, because we just operate in carbon removals. It's a newer space in carbon markets, and when I founded the company in 2021, this industry like barely even existed. Like there was cool technology and labs that was being proven out, whereas today you have actual deployments and you have companies who are doing carbon removal, getting back the data that suggests that the initial thesis was correct and it's possible to do, and then they go into the scaling phase. So seeing real stuff happen on the ground is very exciting for me. Our job is to verify that real stuff and the claims are true and that the carbon removal is actually happening, and then showcase that reality to the market and invite more capital in. But yeah, going from the lab to deployment, I think is very exciting for me to see, and very excited in the next few years for deployment to scale.
Just quickly, I think the acceleration of the technology that's enabling us to really understand ecosystem health and condition, that is essential part of natural climate solutions. Well, it's there, but it's going to be even more scalable in 2-3 years' time. And what I love about that is that it just brings a whole lot of other players into the market. So forest asset managers are starting to value biodiversity as part of their carbon stocks, as well as the commercial value of the wood and the cellulose, etc. So, that and bringing in the whole sort of agricultural production sector is a really important part of the whole carbon equation.
I'm really looking forward 3 years from now not to being asked by every person I met today whether I'll be okay and what's the future for the carbon markets, and actually having a thriving financial ecosystem where we have finally put a price on a huge external liability for many, many corporates. So yeah.
Famous last words.
Famous last words. 3 years.
I have the same conviction. I think between governments and corporates realizing that whatever happens in the next few years, especially with the current political environment, we will be so far off track any decarbonization pathway. This market mechanism is absolutely essential to get there, and I think that sinks in. Even the European Union over the weekend, I think, leaked a paper where the carbon market is now seen again as a core answer. So I have the same excitement. I hope people share that excitement. And I want to thank you for being great panelists, and thank you for the audience.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Well done.